In 1987, Rabbi Israel Ariel founded what's called the Temple Institute in the Jewish quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem. He did so with the express purpose of making the necessary preparations for building a third temple, which the Orthodox Jews believe is essential for the coming of the Messiah. Since then, he has been joined by many other devout Jews. In addition to producing the linen clothes for the priests and constructing sacred vessels that will be required for use in this coming temple, including the menorah, that is the seven-branched lampstand, the showbread table, and of course the altar of incense. They've already produced those, but in addition, the members of the Temple Institute have also diligently pursued the acquisition of an animal that is essential to the operation of temple services. That animal is a red cow. A red cow, normally referred to in the Scripture as the red heifer. In 2015, the Institute began a project called Raise a Red Heifer in Israel. That was the project. Because there had been people who had raised heifers, like down in Mississippi. There was one that they thought back in the 90s, this is the one. And then it was found out that no, it was blemished. There was another one in the early 2000s, I think around 2002. And this looked like a promising, but somehow a bull got in with it. And because it became pregnant, that particular red heifer was no longer okay, no longer kosher. So that was by the wayside. And so then they finally decided, we're going to do our own thing. And they are using basically genetic material. They are artificially inseminating a certain cattle in the nation of Israel. The rabbis said this is okay to do. And so that's what they're doing in order to try and stack the deck and get what they really want. Now, 3 years ago in 2018, it was 3 years into the project, which was 2 years ago in 2018, there were 2 totally red heifers born in the nation of Israel. Born there in the land, as those who were working to that end were hoping. It was in September of 2018. That's almost another month. It'll be 2 years. A little over 5 weeks ago, toward the end, the last day or second to last day of June, the Temple Institute posted an update along with a video showing you these 2 red heifers, indicating that both of them remain eligible candidates for the red heifer sacrifice. But they also caution that very close inspections for blemishes will continue until they reach the age required for that ceremony, the age which is 3 years minimum. So another year before it would really be qualified for the sacrifice, according to what information is recorded in the Mishnah, where you have quite a bit of information about the red heifer that appears. Now, as we, as God's people, the Church of God, know, prophecy does not require the building of a third temple before the return of Jesus Christ. All that's required are legitimate Levitical priests who perform animal sacrifices on a properly built altar in Jerusalem. That's all that's required, based upon the example we have back in the book of Ezra of what happened when Zerubbabel and Joshua returned from the Babylonian exile. When they went back, they built an altar, they began sacrifices. No temple there. They then began rebuilding the temple that had been destroyed, the Temple of Solomon, and that took them several decades to get done. But they did have animal sacrifices, and that's what Daniel shows. There must be sacrifices prior to the end of this age. However, though we understand that, the Orthodox Jews think differently, and they are dedicated to rebuilding a temple. Because of their belief, the procurement of an eligible red heifer and its sacrifice may come in the near future. But what does that mean for us? How does that relate to us? How significant is the sacrifice of the red heifer to us? Today I'd like to review the biblical instructions as well as most of the Jewish traditions concerning the red heifer and review how the red heifer is significant to us in a sense on a daily basis. The obvious place to start is with the instruction of performing the red heifer ceremony, sacrificial ceremony, found in the 19th chapter of the book of Numbers. So here in Numbers chapter 19, first I'd like to just read through the primary section dealing with the sacrifice. I'll do this from the Tanakh translation, and then we will go back and look at and examine the passage little by little. So, in verse 1 of Numbers 19, from the Tanakh translation, the Lord, the Eternal, spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "This is the ritual law that the Lord has commanded. Instruct the Israelite people to bring you a red cow without blemish, in which there is no defect, and on which no yoke has been laid. You shall give it to Eleazar the priest. It shall be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence." Doesn't say by him, but in his presence. "Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. The cow shall be burned in his sight. Its hide, flesh, and blood shall be burned, its dung included. And the priest shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson stuff, and throw them into the fire, consuming the cow. The priest shall wash his garments and bathe his body in water. After that the priest may re-enter the camp, but he shall be unclean until evening. He who performed the burning shall also wash his garments in water, bathe his body in water, and be unclean until evening. A man," verse 9, "who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the cow and deposit them outside the camp in a clean place, to be kept for water of lustration," or as the Complete Jewish Bible helps us to understand better, to prepare water for purification from sin for the Israelite community. It is for cleansing. He who gathers up the ashes of the cow shall also wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. This shall be a permanent law for the Israelites and for the strangers who reside among you. Now, the Jews of Judaism refer to this ritual requirement as a chalk from a Hebrew word. It basically means that its true meaning and significance can never be understood, because they're at a loss to explain what this represents, what this symbolizes. It's impossible. We do it, but we don't understand why we do it. We never can. Moses, they say, Moses understood, but he didn't pass that down to us. And so we don't know for sure what it means. But we're going to do it because God commands it, because it says right here that this is a permanent law, verse 10, for Israelites and the strangers who reside among you. So, that we will do. The truth is that this can be understood. These instructions can be understood if one accepts that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. But you have to accept that in order to be able to piece it together and see that he indeed is represented by the red heifer. Now, there are some clearly seen connections within these instructions here in the first 10 verses of chapter 19. There are definite links and connections to Jesus Christ and the events that were experienced by him in his life and at his death. So, I'd like to examine some of those connections. There are more that you can find by your own study, but I'm going to hit some of the high points here and see that indeed this can be understood. All right, so let's go back to verse 1 of chapter 19. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, This is the ordinance of the law, which the Lord has commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they bring you a red heifer without blemish, in which there is no defect. Now, when you go to the Mishnah, you read the Mishnah, you find out some details that aren't given in the Scripture. The cow was required, the heifer was required to be 3 to 5 years old, according, again, to what the Mishnah says. It was to be carefully inspected to ensure that it had no physical defect or deformity. Could never have had a broken leg or any broken bones, nothing. No defects, no growths anywhere on it. Had to be completely without deformity, without defect. And all of its hairs and hooves were to be red, or a ruddy color. Red is the best way, easiest way to translate it. Now, according to the Mishnah, in the section called Parah 2:5a, that's the way it's listed. If you have a Mishnah, it's in the 6th division under purities. In that section of the Mishnah, it says either 2 black or 2 white hairs makes the cow blemished. Now, apparently it can have 1 black or 1 white hair, and it's okay. But if it has 2, then nope, it's blemished. It's blemished. And so even though it's 99.999, like ivory soap pure, that little bit, it's now blemished. It will not work. And again, there have been a number of red heifers born that could not be considered because they had many more than 2 black or 2 white, including the eyelashes on the cow, have to be red. Everything has to be red. Such an animal obviously is very, very rare. And in fact, according to Jewish tradition and the Mishnah, where we find that, there are only 9 of them that were killed from the first one during the time of Moses until the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Only 9. The 10th, they do say that the 10th is believed to coincide with the time of the coming of the Messiah. Now, again, that is what the Mishnah has for us. Now, so we find here instruction that this red heifer is to be without blemish, in which there is no defect. And just as the red heifer was meticulously inspected for blemishes and defects by the priesthood before it could be used as a sacrifice, Jesus Christ was carefully observed during his ministry as a mortal by the religious leaders in the first century, who could find absolutely no blemish or defect in his conduct or in his teaching when using the Holy Scriptures as the standard of judgment. You couldn't find it because he was perfect in his conduct. He was perfect in his speech, and he was perfect in his adherence to the Holy Scriptures. They could find nothing. Now, they did imply fault to him only when he cast aside their humanly devised regulations and traditions and refused to yield to their egotistic demands. because they wanted to be over the people, and he was threatening their position. But to look at him, nope, he was perfect. His life was perfect. No blemishes, no defects. All right, so we see that parallel. We go on here in verse 2 of Numbers 19. And on this heifer, no yoke has ever come, or on which a yoke has never come. That is, the cow could never have been used for plowing or any type of physical service or work, and it was never to be mated with a bull. It could not be mated with a bull. It had to remain a virgin cow for its life. It had physical life for one and only one purpose. One purpose alone. Now, Jesus never came under the yoke of sin. Never was he under the yoke of sin. And he understood from childhood, from his earliest thoughts, that his mortal life was for one and only one purpose, which he defined. Let's go back to Luke chapter 2. Hold your place in Numbers 19. But back here in Luke chapter 2 and verse 41, here we read, his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. When they had finished the days, as they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother did not know it. But supposing him to have been in the company, because all of the relatives traveled together, they went a day's journey and sought him among their relatives and acquaintances. So when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem seeking him. Now so it was that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. So when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this to us? Look, your father and I have sought you anxiously." And he said to them, please note, at the age of 12, "Why did you seek me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" From age 12, he understood he had one purpose, and that was to fulfill what the Father had given him to do before he surrendered his eternal existence in order to become flesh and blood. In fact, in John chapter 17, when he concluded his ministry as a mortal human being, here in John 17, verse 4, in his prayer to the Father shortly before being apprehended and crucified, he says, "I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work which you have given me to do." He finished the work. He had one purpose, and that was to fulfill the work that the Father had given him to do. He understood it, just as the red heifer was born for one purpose only. Back in chapter 19 of Numbers and verse 3. "You shall give it," that is the heifer, "you shall give it to Eleazar the priest, that he may take it outside the camp." Now this instruction was given while the Israelites were still experiencing the 40 years wandering. During that time, the tabernacle, of course, was built, and then it was set up in the center of the encampment of all the tribes of Israel. The tribe of Levi was assigned the area immediately adjacent to the tabernacle. That's what we're told in Numbers chapter, in Numbers chapters 1 and 2. you find that that was the case. Moses, the families of Moses and Aaron were located on the east side of the tabernacle complex. And then from there you went to the Kohathites. Remember, Kohath, Gershon, and Merari were the three sons of Levi. And so you divide the sons of Levi up. And so then you had the Kohathites on the south side. And as you move on around, the Gershonites were on the west side. And then the Merarites were on the north side. And so the entirety of the tabernacle was surrounded by the tribe of Levi. Then each of the remaining tribes was assigned a specific area within the encampment where they were expected to set up camp. And then you go through Numbers chapter 2, and then it lays out exactly where each one was located. Now, although there is no record in the Scripture of the distance from the Holy of Holies within the tabernacle to the outer perimeter of the encampment, the use of the term outside the camp indicates that there was a clearly recognizable border around the encampment. And that distance was probably the same distance that was later designated at the construction of the temple. Because after the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, it was necessary to establish a permanent border that set the bounds of the camp in order to carry out some of the ordinances, such as the burning of the sin offerings and the red heifer sacrifices that were stipulated in the law. How can you fulfill it? If you don't have a border for it outside the camp, you got to determine what the outside is, or you can't fulfill those commandments, those ordinances. In the 1st century A.D., the Jews, at least this is recorded, the Jews set that border at 2,000 cubits. Now, 2,000 cubits would be the same as, or close to 3,000 feet, or 1,000 yards, 10 football fields is the distance that was set from the Holy of Holies in the temple. From there, they drew this circle, if you will, and that was the boundary. That was the boundary. There was a time when they kind of squared it up, but the boundary was basically 1,000 yards. The reason for doing so was based on the space of the 2,000 cubits that was to separate the Israelites from the Ark of the Covenant when they crossed the Jordan River and entered into the Promised Land. Because you find back in Joshua chapter 3 how when they crossed, it was expected. All of the Israelites had to stay 2,000 cubits away from, on either side, and, all sides, front, rear, left and right side. All had to be. You had your priests who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, who stood in the middle of the Jordan. The water stopped and they were able to go through, but they didn't come by the Ark. They were 2,000 cubits away, 10 football fields away on either side as they came into the Promised Land. And so that's the reason for designating the border of the camp at 2,000 cubits. Now, going directly east from the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, the border of the camp of Jerusalem, we'll call it the camp of Jerusalem, it extended almost, that 2,000 cubits, 1,000 yards, extended almost to the top of the Mount of Olives, which at that spot is over 200 feet higher than the Temple Mount. See, we do need some graphs, but I didn't think about that until too late this week to do. But, oh well, maybe we can insert those in later, or put some pictures in. Anyway, it was on the west side of the crest of the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives runs from north to south. It's not just one hill like that. It's a crest, and Mount Scopus is up on the north, and then it gradually, loses altitude as it goes down on the east side of Jerusalem. And so it was on the west side of that crest, just about 2,000 cubits or just outside the 2,000 cubits border from the temple, that a low ground level altar with a pit that adjoined it was established. That altar was called the Mifkad altar. Mifkad. We'll come to the meaning of it a little bit later. It's not pertinent at this point, but it's called the Mifkad altar. And it was located directly east of the temple. From the altar, looking west, looking due west, those assembled at the altar could look over the eastern wall of the city of Jerusalem, which was purposely built lower than the other walls of Jerusalem on the other sides. But it was purposely built lower. And you could look over the eastern wall of Jerusalem, and over the wall stood this huge gate that Herod had erected when he refurbished the temple and did his thing with the Herodian temple. Anyway, there's this giant gate called the Nicanor Gate. And it stood between the court, the women's court in the temple, and the temple itself, so that you could look through. When the doors of that Nicanor Gate were opened, you could look straight through and you could see the veil of the temple, the first veil that separates the holy place from the outside. Actually, there are two doors there as well, so it was actually right in front of the doors, but the veil was there. And you could see that all the way from this area, from 2,000 cubits or 1,000 yards out from the temple, from the Holy of Holies in the temple, 1,000 yards out. You could look right in, and you could see that giant curtain or veil that hung there in the front of the doors of the holy place. This was exactly what was described at the time that Jesus died at the stake, or I should say, died on the stake at the site of the Mifkad altar, because that's where he died. He died the same place where the Red Heifer died, was put to death. Let's note, hold your place. We'll go to Luke chapter 22. Luke 22, verse 44. Now it was about the 6th hour, or noon, and there was darkness over all the earth, or the New American Standard has, there was darkness over the whole land, until the 9th hour, or 3 in the afternoon. Then the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple, that curtain that hung in front of the doors that opened into the holy place, the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. So, when the centurion saw what had happened, he glorified God. Notice, he saw what had happened. Well, what had happened? Jesus died, yes, but there was more to it than just death, because we are told here that the sun had darkened, the veil of the temple was torn in two. Luke doesn't give us everything. We'll see what Matthew has in a second. But again, when he saw what had happened, he glorified God, saying, "Certainly this was a righteous man." And the whole crowd who came together to that sight, seeing what had been done, beat their breasts and returned. But all his acquaintances and the women who followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things, everything that had taken place. In fact, they were probably some of the ones that Luke went to and interviewed. What happened? What did you see? Okay, they were some of the ones who gave testimony for what he writes here. Now, in Matthew's account, back in Matthew chapter 27, and verse 51, again, more detail is given here by Matthew. "And behold, the veil of the temple," this is at the time that he expired, gave up his last breath, "behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split." Now, skipping to verse 54. "Now, when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus, when they saw the earthquake, note, they saw the earthquake and the things that had happened, they feared greatly, saying, truly, this was the Son of God. So Matthew tells us that there was an earthquake, and that helps us to understand how the veil was torn in two. Because there was a huge beam. I can't remember, I think it's like 30 tons that was across the top of that gate, the stone, and it broke in two, and when it did, it ripped the curtain into two parts. And so, again, Matthew tells us about the earthquake, Luke doesn't. But it was torn, and people witnessed it. Otherwise, Luke couldn't tell us this. The only place this event could have been witnessed was from a location high enough on the Mount of Olives to see over the eastern wall of the city and through the Nicanor gate that stood in front of the temple. Jesus died toward the top of the Mount of Olives, just over 1,000 yards from the Holy of Holies at the Mifkad altar, where the sin offerings and the red heifer sacrifice were burned. The Apostle Paul makes connection to this back in Hebrews chapter 13. Hebrews 13 and verse 11. Hebrews 13:11. I'll read from the New American Standard, verse 11, and verse 12 from the New International. It says, for the bodies of those animals whose blood, that blood was shed where? For the sin offerings. That blood was shed on the brazen altar, the altar in front of the temple. That's where those sin offerings were killed. That's where the blood was collected, was right in front of the temple. The bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place, the holiest place, that is the Holy of Holies, on the Day of Atonement only, by the high priest as an offering for sin. That blood was brought into the Holy of Holies as an offering for sin. But again, the bodies of those animals are burned outside the camp. They were killed within the camp, but they were burned outside the camp. Verse 12 from the New International, and so Jesus also suffered. That is, he was crucified in lots of pain and died by the shedding of his blood outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. And so, again, we find the Apostle Paul is backing up. It had to be outside the camp where he died. It was, again, in the same location because the red heifer symbolized him. He had to die in the same spot, the same location as the red heifer would. Again, it wasn't every day they were offering red heifers. But it's also the spot where sin offerings were offered on the Day of Atonement. All right, back to chapter 19 of Numbers. And verse 3, we go on. And it shall be slaughtered before him, that is, before Eleazar. This suggests that the red heifer was killed by someone else while Eleazar looked on, while he watched what was taking place. If so, its fulfillment occurred when Jesus was stabbed by a Roman spear, the spear of a Roman soldier, and bled to death while the chief priests who were there at the crucifixion looked on. There were priests there. He was killed before the priests. We're not told whether Caiaphas was there or not, the high priest. But remember, Eleazar wasn't the high priest. Aaron was high priest, but Eleazar was a son of Aaron who was to be the one. Not the high priest was to go out there, but others. And this would be fulfilled by the chief priests in the time when Jesus was killed. Now, verse 4, the New American Standard has, next, Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger and sprinkle some of its blood toward the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. Now, since the location where the cow was killed was more than half a mile away, okay, over half a mile away, the priest could not sprinkle that blood right in front of the temple, but toward the temple, toward the west, toward the temple, he sprinkled the blood. Just simply in the direction of the temple is what this means. As in other cases of sprinkling that you find and mentioned in several places in the book of Leviticus, the procedure was done 7 times, 7 being completion. And it was done 7 times to indicate that the blood being used only symbolized the blood of the Holy One who is perfect, 7 being a number of perfection. Only his blood. That's the only blood that can actually cleanse. Cleanses all sin, all defilement, but not the blood of animals. Going on in verse 5 here, then the heifer shall be burned in his sight. Its hide, its flesh, its blood, and its offal, or as most translations have here, its dung, shall be burned. The color of the heifer, again, red, it represented the appearance of shed blood. After being scourged, his face beaten with fists and disfigured, because that's what Isaiah prophesied back in Isaiah 52 verse 14, his visage was so marred, it was hard to make out that he was human. It had puffed up and they didn't break any bones, but they hit him enough and slapped him enough. Remember, they put the covering over his head, and who hit you that time? And so puffiness and no doubt there were breaks in the skin where blood came out, and then they took a crown of thorns and pushed it down over his head, tearing gashes in his head, causing, again, bleeding to come from those wounds. And of course, there was the dried blood that covered much of his body. So red, that symbolized what he looked like. Well, he was the sacrifice for all human sin. The entire cow, we are told here, with the exception of the blood that was sprinkled, was burned. Now, this was unusual, that the blood was burned, because the blood normally was always collected at the altar in front of the temple, the brazen altar. Here the blood was not. The animal was killed outside. Sin offerings were killed inside, their bodies brought outside. Their blood stayed within. Now the blood was shed at the Mifkad altar, and that blood remained in the animal. The body was not cut up into pieces as the animal sacrifices. None of its bones were broken. The entire animal was pushed into the pit or it was on this altar, which apparently may have been built, by logs or whatever, up over the pit, because as it burned, all of the ashes had to be collected. Since forgiveness and the removal of the impurity of sin require blood, it was needful for the ashes to contain blood, so that the blood of the cow was also burned for that very reason. Remember in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22, again, hold your place, Hebrews 9, verse 22. Complete Jewish Bible has here, in fact, according to the Torah, or the law, almost everything is purified with blood. Blood is essential to purification. Indeed, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. So forgiveness requires blood, but purification also requires blood. Again, in chapter 19 of Numbers, verse 6, and the priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet or crimson material as the New Revised Standard has here, and cast them into the midst of the fire, burning the heifer. Now note that there are unspecified amounts of cedar. How much cedar doesn't say. How much hyssop doesn't say. How much scarlet doesn't say. But unspecified amounts were to be burned with the body of the cow. Now, cedar and hyssop both contain or possess cleansing properties. So that made one of the reasons for being included. David, back in Psalm 51, when he was praying and asking God for forgiveness, he prayed that God would purge him with what? With hyssop. So hyssop is a purging agent to help purify. Since cedar and hyssop are both also very aromatic, they both have a very nice aroma to them, they may have been used to give scent to the ashes. So there would be a pleasant scent to the ashes, just like with the oil of anointing, that was prepared. There were certain things that were placed in it, and it had a real nice smell to it, and that may have been the reason for these additions. A branch of hyssop was also used in order to lift the vinegar-soaked sponge up to Jesus' mouth shortly before he died on the stake. Remember, they put it on a stick that was from a hyssop plant in order to hold it up to him. And so hyssop figures into the death of the red heifer. It figures into the death of Jesus Christ in that manner. The scarlet, or the red dye, as it actually was obtained by crushing a certain type of worm. Now, some commentaries say that worm was a worm that inhabited oak trees, but I don't know whether that's the case or not. Others don't say that, but it nonetheless was a worm that contained a very, very brilliant red dye. When you squished it or crushed it or whatever, the red would go everywhere. Like kids would take larvae or caterpillars and squeeze them in order to make them, whatever. But you know how kids are. But anyway, it was made from crushing this worm, which then they soaked up the red color from the worm in generally wool or something. That's the reason some translations say crimson wool or scarlet yarn. Tanakh just says stuff, scarlet stuff. So whatever. Something soaked it up so that they could throw it in. You don't want to throw something wet in to put out the fire, but if it's in something, then you could throw it in the fire and then it would dry it out and burn it up. So whether it was wool or something, it's hard to say because the Hebrew doesn't say wool, it just says scarlet. The word means red. And again, it may have been used to add color, because it was such a profound dye that it may have been used to, and how much of it, again, we don't know because it doesn't say, but they may have added that so that when the ashes were later added to water, the water would turn red, signifying the blood. That's very possible. The prophet David seems to link the worm to Jesus back in Psalm 22 by suggesting here that the extraction of the red color from the worm represented the red blood that Jesus shed, that came out of him because of the treatment he received prior to being crucified. Because here in Psalm 22, verse 6, the Tanakh translation has, "But I am a worm." Remember, these are statements attributed to Jesus as he was on the stake. "But I am a worm, less than human, scorned by men, despised by people." Jesus was treated inhumanely, like the worm that was crushed for the red dye. And so maybe that's the connection that he's making, is to the scarlet material that was placed within the burning pyre of the red heifer. Back in chapter 19, verse 7, Then the priest shall wash his clothes, he shall bathe in water, and afterward he shall come into the camp. The priest shall be unclean until evening, and the one who burns it shall wash his clothes in water, bathe in water, and shall be unclean until evening. Due to the physical contamination from touching the dead heifer. Okay, they touched a dead animal. Due to that contamination, all who were involved in killing and burning the heifer were considered ceremonially unclean until after being washed and beginning a new day. The evening signified the end of that day. A new day begins. Verse 9, Then a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer. The one responsible for collecting all of the ashes was required to be ceremonially clean to prevent any defilement of the ashes. Now that you've got them, you don't want them defiled. And so you had to have one who was ceremonially clean. And going on, and store the ashes outside the camp in a clean place. Once again, so that they could not become defiled. The ashes were required to be stored close to the Mifkad altar. That's what it says. In other words, again, outside the camp is where they were to be. And, going on in verse 9, they shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel for the water of purification. The water of purification is for purifying from sin. Now we're told what they're all about. The water used for mixing the ashes was required to be absolutely pure. The strictness of the Jews with this purity is evidenced in the lengths that were taken for mixing the water of purification for the red heifer ceremony. According to the Mishnah, getting back to what's been preserved there from basically back around the first century A.D., once the temple was built in Jerusalem, the water used for mixing the ashes of the heifer and sprinkled on the priest who was to lead the red heifer to the Mifkad altar and oversee the ceremony, that water was drawn from the pool of Siloam. Now, the pool of Siloam was fed with a stream, the Gihon stream, spring, and again, so that water was constantly being refreshed. It's, basically spring water. In order to make certain that ritual purity was maintained by those involved in the red heifer ceremony, great care was taken to guarantee they never had contact with the dead. Had to be that way. To make sure that it never happened, that there would be no ritual defilement, there were courtyards built in the city of Jerusalem that were built on solid bedrock. And they did that so that there would be no possibility of a grave or a burial chamber existing under the courtyards. Because remember, you couldn't step on an area where one had been buried, or you would be defiled. Coming to Jerusalem, they had to mark or whitewash the tombs so that pilgrims coming into Jerusalem to keep the Passover didn't accidentally touch one or walk on one. They had to stay clear, because if you walk on a spot where there was a corpse underneath the ground is defiled. It remains that way forever. It's defiled because there is death there. And so, again, you had to make sure nothing in the way of a dead body could be below where you are. And so they built these courtyards. Pregnant women came there to these courtyards to give birth to, and then raised their sons there till around the age of 8, I think it was, that the Mishnah says. When the time came to collect the water needed to mix the ashes of the previous red heifers' sacrifices in order to purify the priest who was going to kill the new red heifer, because he had to be ceremonially clean. And in order to do that, the children that were the young boys rode on. They would put a board between two oxen, and that way the boys didn't touch the ground, because they had to travel from the courtyard to the pool of Siloam, and from the pool of Siloam up to the Temple Mount. And so they had to be off the ground so their feet did not touch the ground. If there was something dead there, the oxen's feet would hit it, but they would not. They would still be okay. And so they would ride these oxen down to the pool of Siloam. They used stone jars, which are considered to be undefilable, and they would collect the water and then take that on these boards, on the backs of these oxen, up to the Temple Mount, where then the water was presented to the priest in order to mix up the water of purification, to add the ashes to it, so the priest could be sprinkled. All right, so again, very important, the purity of the water that the ashes went in. Now, verse 10, and the one who gathers the ashes of the red heifer shall wash his clothes, and be unclean until evening. It shall be a statute forever to the children of Israel and to the stranger who dwells among them. Due to becoming physically contaminated while gathering the ashes from the burn pit, the one who had been ceremonially clean had become unclean. Because there's in there in a lot of area that's not just ashes, you've got coals and whatever else. And so he's collected the ashes, but now he is considered to be unclean. Now this could symbolize to some degree what happened when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus took Jesus' body and prepared it for burial and placed it in Joseph's tomb. They both became ritually unclean because they touched a dead body. And you could not keep the Passover if you touched a dead body. Just something to think about. Verse 11, whoever touches the dead body of anyone will be unclean for 7 days. God now reveals that the ashes of the red heifer are directly connected to being cleansed from the defilement caused by having contact with a dead person or encountering death in some fashion. That's their whole purpose, directly related to death. Verse 12, he shall purify himself with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. Then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd and 7th days, he will not be clean. Whoever touches the dead body of anyone and fails to purify himself defiles the Lord's tabernacle. That person must be cut off from Israel, because the water of cleansing has not been sprinkled on him. He is unclean. His uncleanness remains on him. Those who touched a dead body were purified ceremonially by having the ashes of the red heifer mixed with fresh spring water sprinkled on them. The Apostle Paul, back in Hebrews chapter 9, hold your place, Hebrews chapter 9, he connected the symbolism of the ceremonial purification process of the ashes of the red heifer to the spiritual purification process accomplished by the blood of Jesus Christ. Note here in chapter 9 of Hebrews, verse 13, I'll read from the Complete Jewish Bible. Hebrews 9:13. For, Paul states, for if sprinkling ceremonially unclean persons with the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer. So he's talking about the sacrifices on the Day of Atonement as well as the sacrifice of the red heifer here. If that restores their outward purity, now they're considered ritually, ceremonially clean. If it restores their outward purity, then how much more the blood of the Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself to God as a sacrifice without blemish, will purify, the blood of the Messiah will purify our conscience from works that lead to death, so that we can serve the living God. Paul says here that Christ's blood purifies the mind by removing the defilement of sin from our thoughts. Because remember, it's control of the mind that's important to God. Control the thoughts so that there are no sinful thoughts. It says, whoever again touches the dead body of anyone, here in verse 13 of Numbers 19, whoever touches the dead body of anyone and fails to purify himself defiles the Lord's tabernacle or the Lord's temple. And in this case, we know, as Paul shows us in Corinthians, the fact that our bodies are the temple, or the tabernacle, if you will, of God. He dwells in us. And so if there's any defilement, we're defiling the tabernacle. Sin defiles us. Now, back to chapter 19, verse 14. This is the law when a man dies in a tent. All who come into the tent and all who are in the tent shall be unclean 7 days. And every open vessel which has no cover fastened on it is unclean. Verse 16 from the New International, anyone out in the open who touches someone who has been killed with a sword, or someone who has died a natural death, or anyone who touches a human bone or a grave will be unclean for 7 days. As with regular sacrificial offerings, the priest and all sacrificial implements were required to be ceremonially clean in order for him to perform his assigned duty. You could not use anything that had been defiled. Had to be absolutely pure. This was also the case for those who conducted the red heifer sacrifice. It was imperative that precautions be taken to prevent any possibility of defilement from death. It was necessary, therefore, to construct a bridge. In fact, there was a two-tiered arched bridge that was built from the eastern gate of the city of Jerusalem across the Kidron Valley, which is, lies between the Temple Mount. There's the Kidron Valley. I'm going the wrong way for you. Okay, for you. Okay, we we have here the Temple Mount, and then we have the Kidron Valley, and then now we have the Mount of Olives. In the Kidron Valley, again, there are a lot of graves there. In fact, today, it's solid graves. Jews who want to be there because they want to be there at the time that the Messiah comes, and so they paid a lot of money for some of those tombs. And the whole side of, you go way up, and it's just tomb after tomb, there these rock edifices over the graves. So, but in order to not touch anything and become defiled, this bridge was built across the Kidron Valley up to the Mifkad altar, just below the Mifkad altar. It was believed that the air between the ground and the bridge insulated those who crossed the bridge from any defilement of any graves below it. So that's the reason they were up there. If you've got a gap, you've got an air gap, okay, you're okay. Because death cannot penetrate the air. But if it's on the ground, it can penetrate you. Okay, that's the way God established it. You can't walk on a grave or you're going to be unclean. Now, the bridge was also used by all of those who entered Jerusalem from the east. Anyone coming to Jerusalem from the east, there was only one eastern gate. That's all on that wall. And so if you're going to come through the eastern gate, you had to come across the bridge. The reason for keeping the ashes of the red heifer at the Mifkad altar was to sprinkle any who had been defiled by encountering death, to purify them before they could enter into the city. Once sprinkled, they needed to use the bridge to get access to the eastern gate and prevent walking over any unmarked or unknown grave, which would defile them again. Now, it's important to know that the meaning of the word Mifkad. Mifkad means counting or numbering. Counting or numbering. One reason we have the book of Numbers is because of a word that appears early on in the book of Numbers. Numbers. It's about taking censuses. There are several censuses mentioned, and it's about counting heads, numbering. You're numbering. Okay? And Mifkad means numbering. But it's important to realize that because there's another name associated with the same location as the Mifkad altar. That name we find in the New Testament is Golgotha. Golgotha. Because Golgotha is derived from the Hebrew word Gogoleth. Gogoleth, which means skull, it means head, and it means poll. To poll, to get a head count. Okay? That's used in connection with taking censuses to find out how many people there are. Gogoleth was used in Numbers chapter 1, verse 2, right at the beginning. Hence the reason the book is called Numbers. Gogoleth, number. It was at this site where the general population of the city of Jerusalem gathered whenever a census or a head count was required. Because that way you could also count the people who may have been defiled. You can't leave them out of the count because when they're cleansed of their defilement, they can come back in. You had to count them, but they had to be outside the camp. They couldn't come back in for 7 days or whatever. And so you got the census where everybody could be counted. And that's what was done. But there's a whole lot more to be connected with the altar at Mifkad and Golgotha. The most important connection to the Mifkad altar to the site of Golgotha is its direct connection to the altar where Abraham, back in Genesis chapter 22, was prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac. Let's note this. Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. Genesis 22, verse 1. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, and he responded, Here am I. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now the mountains in the land of Moriah included the Mount of Olives. One of the mountains that I'm going to tell you of. Now, many have read this, even I have. Well, he said go to Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is the... Well, no, to one of the mountains in Moriah. One of them. Mount of Olives just happens to be one. Verse 3, So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then, on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship. And note, he said, we, not I, we will come back to you. Because he knew, as Paul tells us in the book of Hebrews chapter 11, that he was prepared to offer Isaac to kill his son. But he knew, as he traveled that 3 days, He realized, God promised me something. He promised me this, and it would be through Isaac. And because of that promise, and God cannot lie, if I kill him, God's going to resurrect him. I know it just as sure as I'm taking the next breath that that's what's going to happen. He was going to do it, but he says, we're going to come back. He was absolutely certain. Verse 6, so Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. He said, here am I, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood. Okay, that's essential for burning a sacrifice. But where is the lamb? The Hebrew word for lamb is seh. You could spell it S-E-H, seh. Where's the seh? Where's the lamb? For a burnt offering. And Abraham said, my son, God will provide. Note, God will provide for himself the lamb, the seh. That's a Hebrew. For a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Now, what Abraham did here is he prophesied what God would do centuries later. Now, he knew God was going to provide a sacrifice, but he wasn't talking definitely about a lamb here, because we find out that it wasn't a lamb that he sacrificed. God will, in the future, provide. Verse 9, then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad, or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was not a lamb, a ram. The Hebrew, ayil. Ayil is a ram. It is a mature sheep, caught in a thicket by its horns. This is not a lamb. So Abraham went and took the ram, the ayil, and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. Note here, Abraham told Isaac that God would provide for himself the lamb. Not a lamb, but the lamb for a burnt offering. Yet at that time, God provided a ram. The lamb of God was for a future time. Verse 14, and Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the, note, the mount of the Lord. In what mount? In the mount. A specific mount. A mount that has, from the very beginning of man, had incredible significance. In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God, provided by God for all of mankind, was sacrificed on the very spot on the Mount of Olives where Abraham had in his mind sacrificed his only son Isaac. Back to Numbers chapter 19. Verse 17. New International translates, for the unclean person put some ashes from the burned purification offering. The New King James says, the heifer burnt for, put some ashes from the heifer burnt for purification from sin into a jar and pour fresh. The Hebrew word is translated in many, if not most cases, living. Living. Pour living. The New American Standard has flowing. pour living or flowing water over them. So the ashes were to be mixed with flowing or living water before being applied to the one who had encountered death. Now, in that respect, let's note Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13. And here, as God of the Old Testament, Jesus Christ makes the statement, "For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me," this was God the Word, who became Jesus Christ, "the fountain of living waters, and hewn themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water." And so we find that the ashes represented Jesus Christ. The water represented Jesus Christ. It all points to Him. Verse 18 of chapter 19 of Numbers. Verse 18, the New International has, "Then a man who is ceremonially clean is to take some hyssop, dip it in the water, and sprinkle the tent and all the furnishings and the people who were there. He must also sprinkle anyone who has touched a human bone or a grave or someone who has been killed or someone who has died a natural death. The man who is clean is to sprinkle the unclean person on the 3rd and 7th days, and on the 7th day he is to purify him. The person being cleansed must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and that evening he will be clean." As these verses show, the original purpose for the ashes of the heifer was connected with ceremonially cleansing those who had touched dead bodies or had encountered death in some fashion. It symbolizes our being purified from the defilement of sins that we commit after having had all past sins forgiven at baptism and coming under God's gracious favor. Because each sin is an encounter with the penalty of death, which is, or penalty of sin, which is death. Every time we sin, we are encountering death. The possibility of death, because we've got to confess that sin for it to be forgiven. Notice 1 John chapter 1, verse 8. 1 John 1, verse 8. "If we say that we have no sin," I haven't sinned since baptism. Oh, we deceive ourselves, John says. "And the truth is not in us." We are lying because we're still human. We still, to this day, possess within us the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, and these are driving forces that we have to overcome daily, on a continuing basis. If we confess our sins, we've got to stay on top. We've got to keep our minds directed. We've got to be led by the Spirit of God. We've got to use the power of God's Spirit to bring every thought into captivity. And if we're doing that, if we're attempting to do that, then we're going to see where we've messed up, where we have failed, where we have sinned. And if we confess those sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us of our sins. How? By His shed blood as the Lamb of God. And to cleanse, or as other translations, purify us from all unrighteousness. How? By removing the defilement of death as the sacrificed red heifer. So, anyway, hopefully that has not confused us too much. There's a lot of material, and it would be nice to have some charts, it'd be nice to have some pictures to help put it all together, but hopefully at least you can go and study it. There's material out there that you can find.